We'll now take a brief look at Joseph Smith Papyri 4, 5, and 6, but we'll save the majority of our time to do an in-depth study on Papyrus number 1, which, as you know, includes the vignette of Abraham upon the altar and is the focus of most of the discussion and debate relating to the Joseph Smith Papyri. Oliver Cowdery believed that one of the images found on the papyri contained a representation of the Godhead. He wrote, "The representation of the Godhead, three yet in one, is curiously drawn to give simply though impressively the writer's views of that exalted personage." Some scholars presume he was referring to the image found here on the top left of Joseph Smith Papyrus number 4. It is not known with certainty whether this image is the one that Oliver was referring to, or whether Joseph was the source of Oliver's belief as many assume. And yet, the scene does seem to express Egyptian ideas that correspond to an understanding of the Godhead as taught by Joseph Smith. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, there are four main forms of writing the word God. A seated deity, as shown on the left-hand side of this scene, is one of those four main forms. The others include a flag-topped pole, a five-pointed star, and a falcon, often on a standard. All of the signs for God could be written twice for dual numbers, or 3 times for plural gods. Here we see the sign for God repeated 3 times, just as there are 3 members of the Godhead. To the Egyptians, the number 3 was an important one, signifying plurality, or unity expressed in plurality. This concept of unity expressed in plurality matches nicely the conception of the Godhead taught by Joseph Smith. He taught that the Godhead is a plurality of 3 separate and distinct gods: God the Eternal Father, His Son Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost. And yet, even though those gods are all separate persons, they act in complete unity. Unity expressed in plurality. Or as Oliver put it, 3 yet in 1. Here are Joseph Smith Papyri number 5 and number 6. When Oliver Cowdery wrote about the Egyptian papyri in a letter to William Fry, he described seeing a representation of Satan tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden. Some believe he was referring to the image on the top right of Papyrus number 5. Oliver wrote, "The serpent represented as walking, or formed in a manner to be able to walk, standing in front of and near a female figure, is to me one of the greatest representations I have ever seen on paper, or a writing substance, and must go so far towards convincing the rational mind of the correctness and divine authority of the Holy Scriptures, and especially that part which has been assailed by the infidel community as being fiction, as to carry away with one mighty sweep the whole atheistic fabric, without leaving a vestige sufficient for a foundation stone." Oliver is clearly connecting this image, or another like unto it, with the biblical account of Satan, who in the form of a serpent tempts Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit. In Genesis chapter 3 we read, "And the Lord said unto the woman, What is this thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. And the Lord said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all the cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life." Most modern Egyptologists would not correlate this scene with the biblical account of the serpent tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden. Rather, they would argue that this image refers to the Sata serpent from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But the question remains, does Oliver's association between the serpent and the devil have precedent in Egyptian mythology? The answer is a resounding yes. There is one example that seems to arise above all others: an ancient Egyptian deity known as Apophis, who is the embodiment of chaos and the opponent of light and truth, or Mot. He has strong and compelling associations with the Christian devil. The Egyptian deity known as Apophis took the form of a threatening serpent. In like manner, the devil, or Satan, took the form of a serpent in the Garden of Eden, and was referred to as that old serpent who deceiveth the whole world in the book of Revelation. In vignettes of the funerary texts and in other settings in which he is depicted, Apophis is shown as a large serpent, sometimes with tightly compressed spring-like coils to emphasize his great size. The fearsome serpent Apophis was the nemesis of the sun god himself. He was the great adversary of the sun god Re and the embodiment of the powers of dissolution, darkness, and non-being. He is frequently portrayed as the enemy of Re on tomb walls and in funerary papyri. Good could not exist without evil, and so just after the sun was created, the sinister Apophis was born. In like manner, the devil is the great adversary of God, who rebelled against God and seeks to destroy the works of God. Apophis represented a source of evil and was the antithesis of the sun, an embodiment of the forces of chaos and evil. If Apophis defeated Re, the world would come to an end. Just as Apophis is the antithesis of the sun, even so Satan is the antithesis of the Son of God. As the true Son, Christ created the world and gave his life to save the souls of men. In direct opposition, the devil seeks to destroy the world and leads the souls of men to destruction. The Apophis serpent is the negation of all things and the arch-enemy of the human race. The serpent is the supreme obstacle to the progress of the sun in his course, and the initiate on his ritual journey. It was thought that he would continue to exist in an endlessly malevolent cycle of attack, defeat, and resurgent attack. This endless cycle of opposition is matched in the Christian devil, for it must needs be that the devil should tempt the children of men, or they could not be agents unto themselves. For if they never should have the bitter, they could not know the sweet. For it must needs be that there is an opposition in all things. If not so, righteousness could not be brought to pass, neither wickedness, neither holiness, nor misery, neither good nor bad. The Apophis serpent was believed to have existed from the beginning of time in the waters of the primeval chaos which preceded creation. Likewise, in the beginning, before the creation of the world, Satan existed and was an angel of God who was an authority in the presence of God, who rebelled against the only begotten Son. Both Apophis and Satan are associated with supernatural events. Apophis was associated with frightening natural events such as unexplained darkness, storms, and earthquakes, as well as his underlying threat to the very stability of the cosmos. When Satan appeared as a false angel of light before Moses, he ranted upon the earth, and the earth shook. Moses began to fear exceedingly, and as he began to fear, he saw the bitterness of hell. Nevertheless, calling upon God, he received strength, and he commanded, saying, "Depart from me, Satan, for this one God only will I worship, which is the God of glory." Just like the Apophis serpent, who is always defeated in the end, Satan was defeated before Moses. He cried with a loud voice, with weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, and he departed hence, even from the presence of Moses. Almost invariably, Apophis is shown restrained, dismembered, or in the process of being destroyed, often by multiple knives. In like manner, Satan will be restrained during the millennium, and in the end, he will be overcome by God. The symbolic parallels between Satan and Apophis become even more striking when one considers their mutual association to sacred trees. A common vignette from the Book of the Dead shows a large serpent, which a cat is beheading with a big sacrificial knife under a tree. It is the sun god or a goddess beheading Apophis beneath the Ishid tree of Heliopolis. No Egyptian temple could be without its holy tree and garden, neither could it be without its sacred serpent. The connection between the sun god Re and the cat was due to the cat's abilities to kill snakes. At night, the sun god sailed in his bark through the underworld where he was threatened by many enemies, among which the giant snake Apophis was one of the most terrifying. Fortunately, the sun god's traveling companions included a large tomcat which was able to deal with this danger. The text concerning the slaying of the serpent before the sacred Ishid tree at Heliopolis appeared in the coffin texts and was then also incorporated into the Book of the Dead. This great cat, the great cat of Heliopolis, is often depicted with the head of a lion. Surely this has symbolic connotations, but what does it mean? One possible answer is that the lion was the symbol of the Lord. Recall that the Lord Jesus Christ is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. As a descendant of Judah, Christ was known as the lion's whelp. When the children of Israel were called out of Egypt by the Lord, Hosea prophesied that they shall walk after the Lord, he shall roar like a lion. And when difficulties arose and some turned to Egypt for help, the Lord promised to defend and preserve his people, like as the lion and the young lion roaring on his prey. The sun god Re is identified as a cosmic lion in the Book of the Dead. Here, the great cat of Heliopolis, often shown with a lion's head, executes a punishment upon the head of the Apophis serpent while standing in front of the sacred Ishid tree. In comparison, the Son of God is identified as a lion in sacred writ. In the garden scene, God declares that as punishment, Christ, the symbolic lion, will destroy or crush the head of Satan, who, in the form of a serpent, stands before the tree which is in the midst of the garden. In both cases, we have symbolic trees, lions, and serpents, and punishments being executed on the heads of the serpents for their opposition to God. In both cases, it is the lion who executes the punishment. Here is the beheading of the Apophis serpent before the sacred Ishid tree, as shown in the Book of the Dead of Hugh Nefer. In this version of the Book of the Dead, Apophis is depicted with tightly compressed, spring-like coils that seem to emphasize his great size. At times, Apophis is depicted with a single large coil, as can be seen in this example from the Book of the Dead of Annie. Let's now turn our attention back to the serpent on Joseph Smith Papyrus number 5. Quoting from the Egyptologist Gertrude Thoussing, Professor Nibley writes, "Thoussing does not hesitate to compare the serpent, who blocks the progress of Re in the meadows of the blessed, with Satan and the Antichrist. Try as he will to spoil everything, he only fulfills an indispensable role in carrying out God's plan. The usual punishment is for the serpent to be deprived of his arms and legs when he is driven out. He is to go with his vulnerable head in the dust, an outcast from the presence of Re. His head is crushed, his tail is placed in his mouth to signify he is his own worst enemy and that he makes no progress. And above all, his children will never inherit and his seed will never increase. He has no future, no progeny. For having rebelled, he is deprived of arms, legs, and posterity. Never again can he be a match for man, who has both limbs and the power to reproduce." Here we see Joseph Smith Papyri 1, 11, and 10, placed according to their order on the scroll of Hor, or Horus. When the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints published the Joseph Smith Papyri in January 1968, critics pounced and proclaimed that the rediscovered papyri proved Joseph Smith could not translate ancient Egyptian and was therefore an indisputable fraud. Their accusation centered on two main arguments. First, the text surrounding the vignette of Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 does not match the text of the Book of Abraham. Rather, the text is from the Book of Breathings of Hor. And second, Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 is an ordinary funerary scene, and when compared to similar scenes, it can be shown that Joseph incorrectly recreated the vignette's damaged portions. Both of the main arguments against the prophet Joseph Smith appear reasonable and convincing on the surface, but are built upon false assumptions. Let's address the first assertion, that the text surrounding the vignette on Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 does not match the text of the Book of Abraham. Rather, it is the text from the Book of Breathings of Hor. With regard to this assertion, all appear to be in violent agreement. The text surrounding the vignette on Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 is not the text of the Book of Abraham, and Joseph never claimed that it was. But this should not come as a surprise to anyone who has actually read the Book of Abraham. Why? Because near the beginning of his record, Abraham indicates that the text he is writing is not adjacent to the corresponding vignette, and as such, to view this scene, he directs the reader back to the beginning of the record. "And it came to pass that the priests laid violence upon me, and that you may have a knowledge of this altar, I will refer you to the representation at the commencement of this record." Recall that only small fragments of the long papyrus scrolls once in Joseph's possession exist today. The extant fragments of the Book of Breathings of Hor measure approximately 27 inches. Also recall that by using a mathematical approach measuring the circumference of a roll and the tightness of the winding, that Egyptologist John Gee has estimated that the Book of Breathings of Horror is missing approximately 41 feet of papyrus. Scrolls of that length often contained a variety of texts. Further, it's not always a given that there's only one scribe working on a scroll. At times, you may have multiple scribes and artists. Consider that even today with modern computer publishing programs, one often finds references to an image or figure located at some distance from the associated texts. While it is understandable why someone would assume the vignette corresponds to the nearby text, and is thereby the source of Joseph's translation, the assumption blatantly ignores Abraham's own statement, as well as the amount of missing papyrus and the fact that it was not uncommon for ancient Egyptian vignettes to be placed at some distance from their associated commentary. In fact, in a study on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Egyptologist Carrie Muhlstein found that the text is only associated with the adjacent picture approximately 50% of the time. The second main argument against the prophet Joseph Smith is that Papyrus number 1 is an ordinary funerary scene, and when compared to similar scenes, it can be shown that Joseph incorrectly recreated the vignette's damaged portions. When Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 was recovered in 1967, it was immediately apparent that someone had attempted to recreate the missing portions of the vignette. Many naturally assumed that 1. The papyrus was damaged before it came into Joseph Smith's possession, 2. That Joseph attempted to restore it, and 3. That he showed his ignorance by restoring it incorrectly. Again, we must be careful in our assumptions. If Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 is an ordinary embalming scene, then few would disagree that the officiator should be the jackal-headed god Anubis, the most important Egyptian funerary god. However, this vignette is not an ordinary scene, and it has numerous elements which make it unique among Egyptian lion couch scenes. As to the assertion that Joseph incorrectly recreated the vignette's damaged portion, it is not known whether the vignette was damaged before or after it came into Joseph's possession, nor is it known who made the restorations, or whether the restorer was even attempting to exactly replicate the document's original state. There is some evidence, however, that the facsimile published in the Times and Seasons newspaper was a faithful representation of the original vignette. In eyewitness accounts of the papyri, the standing figure is described as a priest with a knife in his hand, and as a man with a drawn knife. In 1841, before the facsimiles were published, a Latter-day Saint named William Appleby described the papyri as containing the scene of an altar with a man bound and laid thereon, and a priest with a knife in his hand, standing at the foot with a dove over the person bound on the altar, with several idol gods standing around it. Reverend Henry Caswall visited Nauvoo in April 1842 and viewed some of the Egyptian papyri. Caswall, who was hostile to the saints, described facsimile 1 as having a man standing by him with a drawn knife. Both witnesses of the original papyri recorded that the priest had a knife in his hand. This is very important since there is clearly no knife shown on the papyrus recovered in 1967. Further, the witnesses describe seeing a man or a priest rather than a jackal-headed figure. Their accounts provide a degree of evidence that the vignette published in the Times and Seasons newspaper was a faithful representation of the original. If that is indeed the case, the damage to the vignette and the attempted restoration likely occurred sometime after Joseph had already viewed the original. It may have been after the facsimile was published, or even after the papyrus had left Joseph's possession. Now, as to the accusation that Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 is a common, ordinary, run-of-the-mill funerary scene, let me state that nothing could be farther from the truth. Hugh Nibley wrote, "Of the 100 other figures on lion couches, how many have both hands raised? None. How many of these figures have one hand upraised without having the other clearly visible, placed under the body in the space provided for it? Answer, none. Though we know of one example in which the hand is shown besides the body, but very clearly shown almost touching the knee. How many other scenes show the figure on the couch clothed in the manner here shown? None. All are either nude or fully invested as mummies. In how many is the figure wearing anklets or slippers? None. In how many are the couch, the figure on the couch, and the priest out of line with each other in the strange manner of the Abraham Papyrus? None. We have no replicas in which the artist has made any such blunder or anything comparable to it. How many have crocodiles beneath the couch? Answer, none. How many have hatched lines designated as expanse or firmament? Answer, none of the others has such a design. How many have the 12 gates or pillars of heaven, or anything like them? Answer, none. How many show the lotus and offering table, otherwise common in Egyptian religious and secular scenes? Answer, none. How many show the resurrection, procreation, or embalming scene without the presence of the two ladies, Isis and Nephthys, and or other dignitaries? Answer, none. When a bird is shown flying over the middle of the couch, how often is Anubis in the position shown? Answer, never. How often is any bird shown with wings drawn in the manner indicated? Answer, never. How many have inscriptions matching those in the Joseph Smith Papyrus? Answer, none, though nearly all of them have stereotyped inscriptions designating the nature of the scene. Let's now dive a little deeper into the examples given. If you look closely at the original of Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1, you will see that the priest stands between Abraham and the altar. From the perspective of the viewer, Abraham is in the front, then the priest, and then the table is behind the priest. This is in contrast to the published facsimile, where the priest stands behind both Abraham and the altar. In the 1842 engraving, a figure is lying on a couch and a priest is standing on the opposite side of the couch and its occupant, which is the natural and normal way of seeing things. Either the priest is on this side of his victor or on the other side. But in the original papyrus, he is on neither. He stands in an astonishingly awkward position between the couch and the legs of the man on the couch. Brother Hedlock's attempt to help out the artist, and recall that Hedlock was the engraver who prepared the facsimiles for printing, was covering up a peculiarity in the original that actually supported Joseph Smith's ideas. Other examples can be found in which Egyptian artists draw people in awkward and unusual positions, but in these cases it is also apparent that the artist is consciously trying to show something unusual, and we may safely assume that the oddities in the lion couch papyrus are neither accidental nor meaningless. Next, let's recognize that not all lion couch scenes are embalming scenes. Some are resurrection scenes. Refer to the central panel from the shrine of Opet shown here. Over the reclining figure of the pharaoh on the lion couch hovers a human-headed bird, a form of the god Amun-Re. This central panel from the shrine of Opet clearly resembles the composition of Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1. The most recent studies of this figure agree that the man on the couch is not being embalmed, but is plainly in the act of arising from the couch. Just as life is restored in the resurrection, Abraham's life was restored from certain death by an angel of God. Note that the bird in Joseph Smith Papyrus number 1 does not have a human face, nor does it hover over the person on the couch, often indicative that it is the ba or spirit of the person on the couch. This bird is clearly different. Here is another example of a lion couch resurrection scene. Osiris, who has been put to death by his brother Set, is rising from the dead. The hawk is bringing air or the breath of life so that Osiris can arise from the lion couch. In a typical embalming scene, the officiator shown is the jackal-headed god Anubis. This figure is normally a priest in the regalia of Anubis with a jackal-headed mask. He is the god of burials, with the idea of springing to life thereafter. He is the embalmer of the dead, and the guide who leads the dead towards the throne of Osiris. The god's association with the dead probably originated in the habit of desert canines, scavenging in the shallow graves of early cemeteries. Masks of the god are known, and priests representing Anubis at the preparation of the mummy and burial rites may have worn these jackal-headed masks in order to impersonate the god. But, As we have already discussed, this is not an ordinary embalming scene. Joseph Smith explained that the standing figure represents the idolatrous priest attempting to offer up Abraham as a sacrifice. Joseph Smith's explanation was correct. The standing figure is indeed an idolatrous priest. Whether or not the priest wears a jackal-headed mask to impersonate Anubis while he carries out his duties is irrelevant to his identity. In the facsimile published in the Times and Seasons newspaper, the priest is shown to be either bald or wearing a priestly cap. This is remarkably similar to how other Egyptian priests are shown when they officiate in scenes such as those found at the Dendera temple complex. Additionally, note how the priestly cap was, at times, worn underneath the jackal-headed mask. This is further evidence that the facsimile published is a faithful representation of the vignette before it was damaged. Let's now turn our attention to the man on the altar. Those who have read the book of Abraham know that the text states that Abraham was bound when he was laid upon the altar. Why then does he not appear bound in the vignette? One possible answer is that the focus of Abraham's account was his prayer for divine assistance and his subsequent deliverance by an angel of God. Behold, I lifted up my voice unto the Lord my God, and the Lord hearkened and heard, and he filled me with the vision of the Almighty, and the angel of his presence stood by me, and immediately unloosed my bands. If you compare the Egyptian hieroglyph meaning to pray or to entreat with the position of Abraham upon the altar, you will notice that they are the same. Abraham is indeed praying. He is shown in the proper form of prayer, his right foot forward and his hands raised before his face. While drawing the position of Abraham's body to match the hieroglyph for prayer, how could the artist also simultaneously show that he was bound? In facsimile 1, the first problem that faced the artist scribe, according to our text, was to represent a man who was both fastened upon an altar and praying. He solved his problem with strict obedience to the canons of his art in the only way it could be solved. The man is supine, to indicate his incapacity and helplessness, but even though the man is flat on his back, he is taking the correct and conventional attitude of prayer or supplication, right foot forward, hands raised before the face. Joseph Smith explained that the bird at the head of the lion couch represented the angel of the Lord. To the Egyptians, a bird is a fitting representation of an angel or divine being, as many Egyptian deities were known to be represented by birds. In Egyptian mythology, birds are often used to represent the human spirit, not because the human spirit looks like birds, but because the idea of a bird best represents the spirit's lightness and its ability to move freely and spurn the heavy gravity of the earth. Carrying out the sacrifice of Abraham on a lion couch emphasized the great peril he faced in his impending death. The lion couch was known to be associated with death. Certainly, anyone facing a lion was in great peril. Hence, this lion couch, fashioned in the form of a bedstead, was a fitting altar for the sacrifice of Abraham. Taken in its entirety, the composition of the scene appears to emphasize the battle between opposing forces, between good and evil. Notice that the priest, the lion, and the crocodile all face in the same direction, showing their right profiles. What do they all have in common? They take life. They are sinister figures, literally sinister on the left. In Egyptian common speech, to see the face of a crocodile was to die, and priest, lion, knife, and crocodile all show the man on the couch to be in grave jeopardy. All the other figures, on the other hand, face the opposite direction, the direction in which the immortals face, all of them being invested with divine power to save life. The hawk comes to rescue the hero. The four canopic figures have always had the function of protecting the body from harm and assisting in the resurrection. The lotus, as we shall see, revives the dead and protects the living. Finally, the figure on the couch is brought face to face with his rival and would-be destroyer. The whole composition proclaims the conflict of two forces. Perhaps least noticed and yet most striking is the opposition between the crocodile and the lotus flower. Joseph Smith Papyrus 1 is unique in that it contains figures not found in other lion couch scenes, the lotus and the crocodile, which to the Egyptian mind represent the ultimate extremes, respectively, of destruction and preservation. The ancient Egyptian viewed the crocodile as a dangerous animal and as a symbol of cosmic disorder. The hieroglyph for crocodile was used not only in the name of the crocodile, but also as the determinative in words such as lust after and aggression. In our scene, Pharaoh is lusting after Abraham's life, and possibly also his priesthood, and through aggression he is seeking to take it by force. In contrast to the crocodile, the lotus and papyrus always stood for Egypt in the minds of the people. And because the lotus growing wild afforded ordinary food for the poor, it represents the prodigal life-giving abundance of the land. Lotus blossoms were also a symbol of the sun and of rebirth. On one hand we have the crocodile. To see the face of a crocodile was to die. And on the other hand we have the lotus, representing the life-giving abundance of the land, a symbol of the sun and of rebirth. The forces of evil seek Abraham's death, and the forces of good seek to preserve his life. In the end, the lotus overcomes the crocodile, the canopic figures overcome the lion, and the hawk or angel of the Lord overcomes the priest.